any other questions, we're going to get started and welcome Liz to the stage.
That's awesome. I think that's the first time I've actually gotten applause before I've started the presentation. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. I know there are so many good sessions, and we all can't be in two places at once. We kind of need a time turner. So we absolutely appreciate that you're choosing to be with us in track 2. We have a great track, and I'm really excited about my co-presenters. And I think we're very fortunate that we have a group that has a lot of experience, and we want to leave a lot of time for questions because we want this to be interactive, and we want you to get a lot out of this. I want you to feel that your time with us has been well spent. And if you find that this isn't the right track for you and these topics aren't interesting and you go somewhere else, that's totally fine. We will not be offended. We just want you to just really have a good experience because it's a lot of information. So I guess before I should start, I should tell you a little bit about myself. My name's Liz Horn. I'm a scientist by training. I'm actually a cancer biologist. I also have a degree in informatics. But I spent my entire career working with patient advocacy groups. So you may have seen my name come up either with individual advocacy groups, with Genetic Alliance. And my expertise really is helping advocacy organizations build registries and biobanks. So I spent a lot of time thinking about collecting data, thinking about utilizing data, sharing data, and how to do this in non-traditional ways that actually get results. So being disruptive. Because we know that if the way we always did things if it really worked, we'd have everything solved, and we don't. So we need to find some creative ways to do things, some innovative ways to do things, but also with sound principles and structure, so we're not wasting time, wasting resources, because those are things we don't have a lot of. They aren't limited. So I want to tell you a little bit about this track around data and consent. It's actually 4 sessions. The 4th one is tomorrow. But in this section, we have 3 deep dives. The first one is about individuals. Where do I put my data and what does it mean? And really what I want to do is set the frame for you to help you think about what it means to share your data and some key questions to ask. And there are no wrong answers because everyone's experiences are different. So if your answers are different than the person next to you, it's completely okay. And then I'm going to turn it over to James O'Leary, who's going to talk about how you share your data for research and what it means. And he's going to talk about the peer platform from Genetic Alliance, which was mentioned in the previous session. So I'm really excited we're going to get a deeper dive on that. And then we're going to turn it to Meg Dorr, who you just saw on the stage in the previous session, about creating your consent to share your data. Because consent is really vital because it indicates how data can be shared and how data are shared. So we need to set it up so it can be shared in the most appropriate ways. And then tomorrow I'm going to talk about managing data at the organizational level. So how do you do this from an organization instead of an individual? Do you want to set up a registry? Do you want to set up a biobank? What does it mean? How do you do it? So a lot of good stuff. But I think one thing that's really important is that we all hold a piece of the puzzle, and all of our individual experiences are relevant, and they're all meaningful, and they're all different. So when we only look at one piece of the puzzle, we don't see the whole picture. And I think this gets incredibly challenging in rare diseases because there aren't as many pieces of the puzzle. There aren't as many individuals that have a condition. And these individuals have different experiences. So by putting as many pieces together, we have a better opportunity to get a complete picture. And that's how we can complete the puzzle and start to tell the whole story. And we've seen today that it takes many years to tell the whole story, but we're all making a lot of progress, and we really need to work together to do it. And one thing that is very obvious to everyone in the room is that patients and families are motivated participants. They're important participants. Everybody has really important information. And you understand the needs, the real world experiences, and the barriers. And I think that's a critical message for the medical community, that there are many stakeholders and we all need to work together. And by working together with all stakeholders, we can bring together patients, families, researchers, advocacy groups, sponsors, industries, and government agencies, which we've seen at this meeting. And I think that's what's really special about our time together. So I want to start with some audience participation because I don't know you. I've just told you a little bit about me, and I'm just really kind of curious where we all sit on the spectrum. How many people are part of an advocacy organization for a rare disease? Wow, so probably about half of us. Great. How many of you are a parent or a caregiver with a child with a rare disease, but maybe not part of an advocacy organization? So, okay, great. So much of this is a new experience there, and I think that's really important. Do we have any researchers in the room? Awesome. Thank you for coming. That is fantastic. And then industry? Some industry people, great. Government? No government? Well, that's okay. And is there anyone that I didn't, how do you fit into the space?
I work for an organization that provides solutions for multi-point inhibition, so we work in partnership with different diseases.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today this afternoon. Oh, awesome. So a lot of this we're going to be speaking your language. Although I think that might get more into James' presentation. I'm doing the higher arching key questions. So I think that I want to reiterate, there are not wrong answers. All answers are correct, and our responses can change over time based on our experiences. And I think that's one thing we always have to remember when we're in this space. We all have very different experiences, and you'll see people that they want to share their data with everyone because that's the right thing for that individual, that advocacy group. And then there are others that are a little bit more reserved because there are some data sharing instances that may not be as appropriate. So I just want to validate that all answers are correct. And I'm going to break this up into 5 sections to give you some kind of key questions as you're thinking about all of this. And these questions, we're using the word data, but you could always say data, you could say samples, anything in this research space, you can kind of replace it with. So I want to talk a little bit about options for sharing data. With whom will that information be shared, sort of the privacy piece, and James is going to talk a little bit more about that. What kinds of permissions are needed to share? So this is the consenting piece, and where we're going to hear from Meg. And will I get any results back? And I know we haven't talked a lot about returning results, but I think that's always really important because people, I mean, we all want answers. We want to know what this means and how it fits into the bigger picture. And this one, I think, is underappreciated and not talked about enough. What are my expectations? What are my personal expectations? And those expectations will help lead to satisfaction. And in some ways, knowing what your expectations are going forward, that'll help you make decisions about who to share data with, who to work with, whether you're aligned. Because I find that in situations when you're not aligned, it often doesn't end well. So I think really understanding the expectations. So what are the options for sharing data? There's a couple different ways to do it. You can do it in online communities, and you can also do it within research studies and within the research setting. So very often in online communities, and again, these lists are not meant to be comprehensive. They're just to give you an idea of what are some of the ones out there, like Patients Like Me, like Inspire. There are many disease-specific communities, and there are many others. And often this is sharing data, but it's not in the research setting. And it's really, really valuable information. But if it isn't set up as research to begin with, it's very difficult to use it for research. And so that's where research studies come in with disease-specific registries, with peer, many others. And once we get into research studies, that's really when we start having to think about consent. And there's all of these other kind of research rules and how the research ecosystem works. And then tomorrow we're going to talk about some options at the organizational level. So I would say if your organization is interested in starting in these kinds of areas, come to the session tomorrow or come find me and we can chat. So data sharing considerations. And again, this is more at the individual level. So how comfortable are you with sharing your data? And this is going to differ for different people, and whatever answer you have, that's totally fine. Who owns your data? When you put your data somewhere, someone is going to own that. In addition to ownership, access is really important. So who has access to your data? And who makes those decisions about access? And sometimes we put our data places because we want access to the information. I don't read the data. I don't ever read the agreement with iTunes because I want access to it. And it's just not a good use of my time because I don't think I'd understand it anyway. So I just check the box. And I'm okay with that because I understand that I'm sharing certain things. I use Google. I love Google. I know that they are tracking me because I'm trying to buy something on Amazon and then I go somewhere else. I'm like, oh, that girl cover I was just looking at. And so I'm totally fine with that because I want access to those services, but I know that I'm giving up some privacy. And so I think just having a framework of how comfortable you are about sharing, who owns it, who are they going to share it with, and what's your comfort level. And really, when I say comfort level, that's really how does that make you feel. And I think it's important that your privacy preferences align with the data sharing policies of the entity that you're sharing your data with. And again, many people are an open book and they want it to be shared with everyone and others aren't. So I think it's just important to look at the fine print and ask questions. So what about consent? Is informed consent needed? In a lot of these virtual communities, consent is not needed because you're really just sharing information between others. You're trying to understand how you fit into the bigger picture. But in research studies, consent forms are typically needed, and there are very often special considerations for genetic data. So I think it's really important, and Meg's going to talk more about consent and what to think about and why we have it. But I think this piece, again, is often underappreciated, and I think you did a really nice job earlier today when you talked about you're working with a researcher and you get this 20-page thing that's written in legalese and you don't quite understand it, but you sign it anyway. But it's really an opportunity to ask questions to really make sure you understand and to make sure you're comfortable with the pieces and what's going to happen. And consider allowing recontact for follow-up and saying, yes, you can keep in touch with me. Yes, I'll give you more data. Yes, I'll update my information. Because as we're trying to fill in all these blanks, we know that life's a movie and it's not just a snapshot. And in a lot of these, when you get a data point, you're just sort of taking a picture. And this is what everything looks like on this day. But then it might be different in 3 months. It might be different in 6 months. And I think it's incredibly important in areas where we don't have a lot of information, where in rare diseases where there aren't a lot of patients, we really need to understand the full patient experience. Another thing to really consider is, will results be returned? Will you get information back? And this, I think, is important to a lot of foundations. In some ways, you're getting aggregate results of how do I compare to others. And so there's a picture on the side of the Phelan-McDermid syndrome registry. And one of the things about this patient population is the kids don't feel pain appropriately. So they have a very, very high pain tolerance. And the children are also nonverbal. So that's a tough situation because you have someone who's in pain that can't quite communicate it, but because they don't feel pain like everyone else, they're really, really in pain by the time they get there. So sometimes, especially, it's part of, we have aggregate charts within our registry, and we're able to see how these individuals compare to others. And so you can see that the vast majority, probably 85%, have a higher than usual pain tolerance in this registry example. And one way parents have been using this is taking some of these aggregate charts to their pediatricians, to other people, to schools, to help say, hey, this is what's going on. You may never have met another person with this condition, but this is what this condition looks like. There are also individual research results. So what are the results from the research conducted on my samples, on my data? And some studies will give you the data back, and I think it's important to ask questions. What kind of data will you get back? Will you get anything back? And how important is that to you? Because I think that we have a great opportunity, especially in places that, in conditions that are rare, to say, well, we want this data back, and I think there's more leverage to get it back. And a lot of this has to be done at the beginning of the research study, so these are important things to think about as you're setting it up. And then there's something called incidental findings. So if they find something that's medically important, they'll often let you know. And so you need to ask, is returning research results important to me? And with what level of returning results am I most comfortable with? Because if you're agreeing to be part of a study and you want data back and they say, oh, and maybe there's 3 studies you can participate in, and the first study said, well, we don't give data back. That might help you, oh, sorry, this is heavy. That might help you decide what research study to be a part of. So I think that's another important consideration. And then what are your expectations? What are your expectations of what will happen with your data? Do you want do you want to have data to share with providers? Do you want to have data to help other families? Do you want the data to just be research driven? Do you want it to appear in peer-reviewed publications? So I think knowing what your expectations are on how the data will be used will help you decide on these opportunities if it's a good opportunity for you. And how do you expect that organization and entity to handle your data? And are there data sharing activities that you're uncomfortable with? And I think that's really important too. Because again, no wrong answers, everyone has different comfort levels, but I think having these conversations can really help move it forward. So there's 2 kind of unique spots, interesting places that I want to talk about. One is about getting your medical records. This is becoming an area of increased interest and conversation, and this is a recent survey from Medscape of 1,400 clinicians and 1,100 patients asking them who owns medical records. Well, when you look at the physicians, and I think I have a pointer, maybe. Oh, I do, yay. Okay, 39% of physicians believe they own the patient's medical records, and 54% of patients believe they own their own medical records. And so we have a little bit of a disconnect here. That's kind of a difference on those bars. And we know that as patients, we all have access to our medical records, but because of this disconnect, sometimes it's hard to access them. And so I say it's easier in theory than in practice. And in one of our projects right now for the Phelan-McDermid syndrome, we're part of the COREnet patient-powered research network. We're collecting medical records, and we were having families go to their physicians to get medical records. And in some cases, it was quite difficult. Physicians will share peer-to-peer without charge, but very often to share back with patients, they'll have a page charge. It can take a long time, and Jean's shaking her head in frustration in the back. You know, it's really, really tough. So we found that, and in some ways, the physicians and staff, they honestly weren't as nice as they could have been to patients and families in the reactions, and it was correct. And it seemed as a burden and a hassle, and it was a little disappointing. And I get it, they're busy. But what we found is there are vendors to assist in collection, and there are services that can help you get that. So in terms of getting medical records, there are some ways around it. So if you have any questions about that. Yeah.
Are there any of the premier organizations that are doing a great job of getting medical records and having it available on the internet for families to access?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways to go about it, and there are different vendors that can help you. So one of the ways is by using what's in patient portals that some of us have access to if we have Epic. So, and I would say Epic's the electronic health record that has it, but others do as well. So, but in that instance, you're only having access to what the physician puts up there for you to have. So you might have test results, you might have certain things, but you don't have the clinical notes. With the patient.
I'm going to have you guys for questions. I'll have the mic.
Oh, sorry, I should have repeated that question.
No, that's fine. Just so we can capture it for the people that are going to be watching the webinar after.
My question was just about accessing medical records, families being able to access those anytime, anywhere.
So if you're in a medical system and they have an electronic health record that has a patient portal and they've turned that portal on, yes, you can. And I'm fortunate enough that I'm where I go to the physician, they have Epic, so I have access. But not everyone has that kind of access. That access is also controlled by the physician or the healthcare entity, and you are getting maybe specific test results. You're not getting the full record. You're just getting pieces of it. And some of the research that we're doing, we are actually looking at clinical notes, and we're using natural language processing to mine those clinical notes, so we want everything. And so we've had families go to get their medical records, and some they've been able to get quite easily, and we have a secure file transfer that they can put it up for us, and then we can get it to the researchers. But in other cases, it hasn't worked so well. There have been page charges, gaps in timing. And so there are two services that are competitors. We're actually using one called CareSync, and they are a fee-for-service provider that you can have you can enter all your providers, and they will then go contact the providers and get the medical records. And there are other competitors to CareSync that I know others are using, like CareBox, and that's another option as well. And I know that we'll start to see more and more of these different companies. And I think that as you're talking to different people, they'll have different experiences. And one thing that we've really learned, at least with our patient population, is a lot of these kids are pretty sick, so they go to a lot of doctors, and they have, what used to be binders. And so it's even though we are working with a third-party vendor, they're still, in some instances, the vendor's having some challenges with the physicians. So I think that when you're looking for medical records, it's still challenging, but we all have access to our medical records, and we're going to start to see this evolve more as more patients are frankly demanding them, and we should, because they're ours. And then I want to just, before I open it up to questions, talk a little bit about biosample considerations. So is anyone interested in creating a biobank or doing things with biological samples? Okay. Great, you have. Okay. So I think that there are some I just wanted to make sure I wasn't going down this tangent that no one was interested in. One of the real challenges with biosamples is that they're a finite resource. And, in some instances, and they're very precious, and they're not trivial to obtain. And in some instances, blood tends to be easier to obtain than tissue. Tissue can be very difficult, and there are certain tissues that are very, very rare. Like, for instance, it's hard to obtain brain tissue except upon autopsy, and then that's a very, very finite resource. And even in some patient populations, a blood draw for some people is quite easy, but for others it's not. And so it's just not trivial to obtain. And there are several different types of collections. There might be an institutional collection where that group, either at an academic institution, there are some of these at the NIH, where they will collect samples and make them available to many researchers. There are others where they're collected by individual investigators, and these individual investigators can use them for their research, and they may or may not share with other investigators. And then there are a lot of advocacy groups that have just found ways to just go out and do it themselves in order to facilitate sharing. Genetic Alliance has a biobank, and they've really been one of the leaders in this. And I think that when we're talking about samples, almost everything I've said about data applies, but we just have to remember that it's finite resource. It's really precious. I mean, data we can share with everybody. We can just keep making copies of it and giving it to everyone else. And when we get down to access and you're providing a biological sample, you might want to think about who owns the collection, who has access, who determines access. Because if you have different options, you might want to go into a collection where more people can use the samples. Ooh, I went too far. And very often you'll have different kinds of sharing options for your samples, whether it's to be shared with any diseases, related disorders, or even just your disease of interest. And again, depending on your unique situation, people are going to have different opinions on this level. And I think the only other thing to think about is for people with rare diseases, what happens when we donate to multiple collections? Because if there aren't a lot of people out there with a certain condition, and we have 2 different collections, but 30% of the people are shared because there are 2 competing researchers, and one's in Boston and one's in New York at Columbia. So a lot of the kids have gone up to see the the physician in Boston, and then they've also gone to New York because it's relatively close. So I think that in some ways, when we get to, eventually we'll have unique identifiers and we'll be able to know when individuals are within different sample collections and when that's the same sample. And things don't really talk to each other as well as they could. And a lot of this is siloed, but I think it's just something to consider with multiple collections. And one of the things we've done is when we've collected samples, we've said, have you donated? Because usually if you're the advocacy group, you know who else has collected samples in your disease. There's a short list of researchers. There may be 4 or 5 different collections. It's not like it's hundreds of people. And we'll ask, have you donated to this? Have you donated to that? And just kind of get an idea of where these samples are and how much overlap, and that really helps the science. So I just wanted to add that we'll talk a lot more about biobanking tomorrow, but there are just some slightly different considerations from the data piece. So my final thoughts, and then I'll open it up to questions. Consider sharing your data, but share it at the level you're most comfortable with. And part of that is trust, and trust in the people that have the data, are processing it, that are sharing the data. And ask questions. That's how you build trust. And if we don't add our pieces together, we're never going to complete the puzzle. But I think we all have to find the speed that's right for us about how we get into this space. So with that, I think I finished maybe a little early because I didn't see signs come up that I was running over. I will open it up to questions. Yeah, 20 minutes for questions. Awesome.
On the issue of whether or not the data collection company, business agency will share pertinent medical information with you, what are the deciding factors for that organization to say yes or no about sharing something they might find, and why do they do that?
So just to reframe your question to make sure I understand it, when you're sharing your data with an organization and they're doing some data analysis, how do you get them to share it back with you?
Your slide talked about some will share pertinent medical information with you and some will not.
Oh, got it. Okay. So
And that's my question. Why do some decide to do it and some not? And what's the process? Is there a legal reason why they don't, or?
So I'm going to answer it, but then I'm going to let Meg jump in because I'm trained as a scientist, Meg's trained as a genetic counselor. Genetic counselors are awesome just with all the things they know and their experiences. But a lot of it has to do with whether it's medically actionable, and very often when I've run research studies and I've seen something, I've had to go back to the IRB to ask if I can share that data back. But I'm going to turn it over to Meg to answer it.
So when we think about research studies, the way the research study is designed determines whether information can get shared back with participants. So some research studies are designed so that participants share data with the researchers, and they do so in an anonymous way, and it would actually be there would actually be more risk to their privacy, or more risk to the confidentiality of the data, or more risk to their anonymity by recontacting them. So the institutional review board, the ethics board that reviews the research, will say, we agree with your plan not to share back data because to have mechanisms to share back that data would actually be potentially a greater risk to the participant than not sharing the data is. And so this, I think, leads to the point of, well, who designs those research studies? And if I were a patient advocacy group, I would want to be involved in designing the research study from the start so that I said to the researchers, you know what? There is a risk of loss of privacy or loss of anonymity, but our disease community is willing to bear that burden of risk so that we would get back the data that we donate, or so that we would get back the insights in real time. But without an advocate there at the table co-designing the research, for researchers and for ethics boards, it's sometimes easier to say, well, we want, I mean, one of the whole points of consent, and we'll get to this in my talk later, we are beholden as researchers to minimize the risks and maximize the benefit. And so in our ethical obligation to minimize risks, we go with what's the least risky strategy. But if we have advocates saying we're willing to take that risk because the benefit is going to be so great to us, ethics boards listen to that, researchers listen to that, and you can build it in from the start. This is very different, research, very different than your clinical notes. So when you receive clinical care, that clinical care is documented, that clinical care required by law to be released back to you. You are the owner of that information. And so although health systems, physicians may be reluctant to do so, may throw up barriers to doing so, it is your legal right. They are required by law to return those clinical notes to you, because that's the course of your care. And so there's two very different domains of data here. Data collected for research falls under very specific, separate legal regulations, and then clinical care data falls under very distinct regulations. And then there's clinical trials somewhere in the middle, which is sort of a gray area. But does that help clarify? Okay, no worries.
I just wanted to add one quick thing. When you're talking about the legal right to have access to your clinical notes, a lot of physicians are uninformed, and that's one of the barriers we've been bumping up against, because we're having to educate them, and sometimes with varying degrees of success. So I think that as the field moves forward and this becomes more common, I'm hoping in 3 years that this isn't an issue and that barrier is gone, or maybe sooner than that time. But that's one of the challenges we've had. And you had a question back there in the peach? Sorry.
But when you have, there's clinical, there's research, and then there's translational. And so you've got patients that are coming in for purely, they're coming in for clinical reasons, but this is also the entire research program for the researcher, and they're going through a consent process and all of that. And I just think that it starts to get interesting at that point.
Well, and they're wearing multiple hats. And I think that some medical professionals are really good at telling you what hat they're wearing when they're interacting with you, that yes, this is for a clinical research study and I'm interacting that way, versus I'm interacting as your provider. But some of them, and everyone's really busy too, so sometimes I think those distinctions, and James?
Yeah, the clinical trials one I think is really interesting too. I was at a meeting last year on patient-centered clinical trials, and the whole field is changing. So that's the important thing with all of these, is if we give this talk in a year, it's going to be a different talk, because advocacy organizations and a lot of nonprofits, especially in this space, and are really pushing hard for things to change. And a good example of that is clinical trials in which the clinical trial costs, maybe many millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. And if the trial is biased in some way by sharing information across participants, for instance, it can kill the whole trial. So at that meeting, one of the advocates, who was speaking was saying, I killed a clinical trial, because she essentially blogged about her trial results. And so that's a real concern that exists. Now, on the other hand, though, this is useful clinical information, and it's also, information that if there's a positive result or a negative result, that could impact other trials, that could impact care. People really want to know that. So there's a lot of kind of alternate clinical trials designs that are going forward that try to give more information back to people. Try and end trials early, especially for rare diseases, if there's a certain threshold of positive results that occur. that try to share information back after the trial is over in terms of medical records. And that's an increasing trend that we're seeing. Some of it I think we're still figuring out. Is that as valid as standard blinded placebo trials? But especially with rare diseases, that's frequently not an option. Especially when if you can't get enough people in the trial because everyone's using something off-label, for instance, then that trial is going to fail in its recruitment. Now that there are also, for some rare diseases, many trials, which is like this dream position to be in, there's concern about, can we even fill those trials if there's 4 trials going on for a rare condition? So all of these factors on what you give back and potential bias matter, because they're going to determine how many people are going to enter into that trial in the first place. So just a little bit more context about that. This space is changing really quickly, though now it's going to keep changing.
I didn't see who's next, so I'll let you figure it out.
Hi, I'm Roberta from the Alagille Syndrome Alliance, Board of Directors there. So we have a patient registry that we're running into a few snags with.
And that's not uncommon.
Right. So
That's not uncommon at all, but go on.
So two of the things that we are really looking to push through are, we need a new questionnaire. We need to refine what information that we're getting, and do we hire a researcher to do that, or do we fill that role within and hope to God that we get the right information to move forward and help with our trials? And also, we're struggling to promote a database that's been around for a while, where we might have, we have a newsletter that goes out to 1,000 people worldwide. We might only have 120 people signing into the registry. The promotion is a big deal, and we need to figure out our questionnaire and who does that. Can you help me with that?
Yes. And so questionnaires are really challenging. And in one of the presentations earlier, and I think it was the guy from Google, but I don't remember if it was him, he had a list of, depending on what are you using the data for. So depending on how you want to use the data, that leads you to how you design your questionnaire. And so I think the first question, well, I'm going to take a step back. So in all of this is something that we definitely have to do together with input from others. So this is one of the, it's going to take longer, but we're going to walk together and we're going to get to the right spot. So I would say you're going to need to convene a group of people to help you think this through. Some researchers who will be thinking about how will data be used and what kinds of information do we need to ask. So if you want to use things for the FDA, that's a really different kind of questionnaire than if you're doing a natural history study. And that's a really different questionnaire if you're just trying to get sort of some baseline symptoms to know who would be eligible for a clinical trial. That said, you absolutely need expert opinion of people who will be who know the syndrome, who know the disease, so those clinicians. And I love those clinicians, but most of them don't know how to design a questionnaire. So it's really important to work with them on what are the key concepts, but in designing the questionnaires, talk to people that really know how to design questionnaires. And there are a lot of people out there that love to help with this because they often don't get asked for those kinds of things. But they're people with epidemiology backgrounds, with informatics backgrounds. I think genetic counselors have great insight onto this. And very often they're the people that are using the data. So I'm going to give you a really quick questionnaire example. I worked with a group and their question was, do you have kidney or liver problems? Yes or no? Well, here's the thing. If I answer yes, do I have kidney problems? Do I have liver problems? Do I have both? And they're world-renowned clinical scientist, like the most knowledgeable man about the disease, who was a lovely, lovely person. That was his question. But that just doesn't lead to good data analysis. So sometimes it can be challenging because we had to push back on him, and that was a position they weren't very comfortable with. But we broke it into 2 questions. Do you have kidney problems? Do you have liver problems? So I think so the point of that example is knowing questionnaire design is really critical because it's with data, garbage in, garbage out, so you need the best. But all that said, you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And So you want to be, to your point earlier, you want to be thoughtful, you want to move forward, but if we wait till everything's perfect, we'll never move forward. So it's trying to find that balance. So get a key group of advisors to work with. Talk to people from other diseases that have registries. Recruitment is a huge problem, I think, for many people. And I think really just sharing some best practices. I don't know if you're involved with Genetic Alliance and their listservs. Those, I think, would be really great, ripe questions to help hear from others who've had good experience. Because really, if you have 1,000 people in the world, it's going to be so much better to have as many of those people in the registry as possible. And then I think, too, thinking about burden. Is your questionnaire too long? Can it be broken up into smaller bite-sized nuggets? Can people stop and start? I mean, I worked on one with a population that was really fatigued, and their questionnaire was really long. And for a population with a lot of fatigue, that was, it's a huge problem. So, and I think the other thing we're finding is we're seeing questionnaires that can be converted to smartphone apps, and that's making it easier for people. And so I think we're getting there. And I think another thing too, even surveying your population, your people, why haven't you signed up for the registry? Is there information? And this is to your survey that James has some really good questions he's going to present in a few minutes. Really trying to help understanding why, and are there things that you can do as a foundation, as an organization, to help move that forward. But I would say that's not uncommon and it's hard, but I think that it's the fact that you're asking the questions, you're moving in the right direction.
It's a little out of sequence, but following up on the context thing, there's some of the terminology that starting off in the process I haven't really got a good handle on. Is there any way to, knowing it's not the right session, diagram the process of going from registry into trial, being the separation of clinical trial to transition to transitional trials? We really need to get a handle on, because that's what we need to focus to get recruitment, is to understand to people what's the value of the registry anyways. It's so you can get into something, and I think that's
no, absolutely. So it's understanding the translational ecosystem, and this is a project that Genetic Alliance does, so I'm going to pass the microphone to James. That I did work on.
Yeah, well, and there's a Global Genes has a toolkit that I believe that they've been working on around kind of space. I think it's like, the first steps to developing a registry and that type of thing, and which is great. Also, if you really want to, we're developing a new version of a tool called NETS, which is Navigating the Ecosystem of Translational Research. Just remember NETS, N-E-T-S. If you search Genetic Alliance NETS, you'll find it. But essentially what it does is it breaks down all of the pathways of translational research. So from, basic science research and mouse models, assay development and, clinical trials, and into kind of neighborhoods. And you can click on any of those neighborhoods and find out resources or tools that exist throughout the community for people working on those things. So assay development is a good example. Having an assay for your condition is extremely important, but finding the right researcher to help develop that assay is difficult. Not that many people focus just on assay development. And then using that assay to compare it to potential compounds, for instance, screening against a large number of compounds. There's a whole other group of people that's good at that. There's a group called NCGC, I believe, at the Office of Rare Disease Research, or actually now it's under something called, what is the new institute, NIH? Why am I blanking on? NCATS, yeah, NCATS, the National, that sounds right, yes. So if you search that, you can click through. But this is a big problem. There isn't a really good, very user-friendly tool where you can just click through and say, I have a registry, I have, maybe a natural history study for my disease, I don't have an assay, I don't have industry partners. And it would say, okay, great, do 1, 2, and 3 in that order, and that will help you be more attractive for industry to develop treatments. And so that's something where I think collectively a lot of these groups and Faster Cures and those types of groups are working on.
Yeah, and there's a couple resources at Train as well, but which is part of Faster Cure's Translational Accelerator, but I don't know what Train stands for. But that said, you can't be an expert on everything. So I think what's really important is to start to become familiar with the terminology, and one of the speakers this morning said it really well, being able to say sort of, we need a clinical trial and here's the top barrier. And so really being cocktail party smart about a lot of these things, and then work with the experts that can really help you do the deep dive. And the piece in this field that I've always found is that people are really, really willing to help and share their expertise, because it's a difficult journey, and people have been on it, and they want others to have an easier journey than they did, or at least to not get stuck in the same snags.
Okay, so unfortunately this will be the last question because we have to go to the next presenter, but we have the same people, so I'm sure the questions will be kind of throughout this breakout.
Hi, Tom Christie. Just a fundamental question for you. Like I said, I've been involved in this kind of
Can you put your microphone?
Involved in this kind of activity for about 20 years. You know, 15, 20 years ago, there was a revolution in business called business intelligence, or you know, informatics or business intelligence, where the banks and the insurance companies and a lot of the larger corporations got involved in data warehousing, analytics, and reporting. And it seems to me like the medical community here, you know, I've been looking into it, and I'm actually involved in a project, is getting involved at the level that business was trying to do 15, 20 years ago, and they've learned all their lessons. And I guess my question is, why aren't more of the principles of data architecture, storage, security, access not being carried over rather than reinvented?
So I love how you just set James up for a really important part of his talk, and he's going to talk in detail about that. But just at a very high level, I think part of the reason we're behind in science is that doing the science has always been very, very expensive. It was very, very expensive to do sequencing, and now it's really coming down. They're talking about the $1,000 genome. Now it's the $250 genome. We're going to get to some point where, you know, it's like $20. We're not there yet. So the cost of science was very, very expensive. And then it was producing such large amounts of data that no one knew how to handle it, how to store it. The devices to analyze the data just weren't big enough. And so now all of this is catching up, but we're still behind. And I think that we're really going to just start to see more and more to move forward. But it is very much an emerging field, and we're going to have hiccups. Yeah, but I think part of it was the cost to do the science and how big our data sets were. But we have a long way to go. We've rewarded being in silos in research. So I'm going to turn it over to James. Thank you so much.
Can we give her an applause here?
I think we have a break.